Well, good afternoon, and I want to thank Rose and the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. What I can add to this conversation, I think, is a little reflection on how North Carolinians have commemorated the state's history, their history, and what of the past they have commemorated. As you might predict, North Carolinians have commemorated their history, the history that is peculiar to this state, particular to this state. So they've honored events and historical figures of local importance. But they've also commemorated figures and events of national importance. And there's been a cadence to the commemoration in this state and to the nation at large. So the landscape that we move through every day, particularly here in Raleigh and a few other parts of the state that are particularly dense with commemoration, but the landscape we move through is not a product of some sort of steady accumulation of monuments, but actually it's been the product of several waves of monument building. And so this is the backstory that I just want to fill in because I think it's relevant to a conversation today about what it is that could be commemorated here, who will be commemorated, and how that commemoration might take place. And I want to engage in just a very small moment of shameless promotion. This is for a digital archive and website that a number of us at UNC Chapel Hill have been working on for a number of years. And you can go to it. It's called, if you just type into your search bar, COMM, Lands of North Carolina. So it's Commemorative Landscapes of North Carolina. And this is just a page that we've pulled up. And the reason I want to draw this to attention is if you look on the far left column, you'll see the number of monuments erected in this state by decade. To date, we've got an inventory of about 700, and we're getting close to 800. And the important point that I want to make here is that there actually are two great waves of monument construction in this state. One of them is between 1890 and 1920, roughly, and the other we are living in. And so I want to fill in the story here. We don't need to linger on the period before the Civil War. North Carolina was bereft of almost any significant commemorative sites. A few North Carolinians started to commemorate Moores Creek down near Wilmington, Guilford Courthouse, and Kings Mountain, which I realize is just across the border in South Carolina, but North Carolinians were as interested in the commemoration of Kings Mountain as South Carolinians were. So my simple point is, before the Civil War, to the extent that there was commemoration in North Carolina, it was comparable to, I would describe, the Washington Monument. And now if I could pull up the first slide, this slide makes as effectively as anything I could say does. Some of you may know that the Washington Monument stood uncompleted for decades and decades. And so when the slide comes up, it will be of an image of the Washington Monument in 1876, as yet, eventually. It's coming, just like the monument itself. It took a while. So, simple point being that essentially the commemorative landscape of the state was largely empty. After the Civil War, there it is, 1876, that's what it looked like. After the Civil War, North Carolinians, of course, had ample inspiration to want to start to fill the landscape, having just endured the trauma of the most bloody war in America's history to that point, and indeed in American history. But there were deep divisions in this state, as you all know. There were, of course, the memories of Unionists. There were more Unionists in this state than any other southern state. There are more North Carolinians who fought for the Union. There are, of course, Confederates. There were whites, blacks. So it made commemoration of the Civil War in this state very difficult. And it's worth remembering, it's not as though those divisions didn't evaporated quickly. As late as the election of 1876, the memory of the Civil War was at the center of that election. And as late as the 1890s, Republicans and populists in the state legislature were reluctant to spend money to erect Confederate memorials in this state, including the memorial that stands in front of the state capitol in downtown Raleigh. But after the 1890s, things began to shift, as I'll talk about in just a moment. But in addition to the challenge of the divided memories, there was a challenge of trying to develop a commemorative aesthetic that was appropriate to record the sacrifice of millions of Americans during the Civil War. If you think about the conventions of 18th and 19th century statuary, they typically represented heroic generals, right, or heroic soldiers, single men of action doing heroic deeds. Well, that hardly seemed appropriate for the type of slaughter of the American Civil War, where there were hundreds of thousands of men who died of disease, not on the battlefield. There were tens of thousands of men who died in mass charges where their own heroic action was difficult to conceive of. Not suggesting it wasn't heroic, but it was hard to figure out how one would represent that in statuary. So neither Northerners nor Southerners were comfortable with the conventional representations that had been used in heroic sculpture. And now let's go to the next slide, which is actually from slightly later than the period I'm talking about. Some of you may know this slide, may know this sculpture. I think this is the most imposing sculpture in the state. This is of Nathaniel Greene at the Guilford Courthouse battlefield site. It's actually put up in the designed in the teens, but it's a classic example of a heroic man on on a horse. Well, in the 20 to 30 years after the Civil War, Americans gradually started to figure out a vocabulary they could use to represent the sacrifice of the Civil War. And we're familiar with what they came up with because the monuments that they eventually settled on dot the landscape of virtually every northern and southern community of any size. And let me just go to the next slide, which shows you a sequence. The monument on the left is from Cumberland County. It's one of the very first Confederate memorials in the South, and indeed in the state, from 1868. The memorial on the right top is from Wilmington. That's one of the first monuments of what we might call a common soldier. And then down below, I think that's Stanley County. That's the kind of monument we all take for granted. So the point is, by the turn of the 20th century, Northerners and Southerners could literally get a mail order catalog, flip through the pages, and find the Yankee or Confederate of their choice, mail order it from a forge in the north, typically the north, and it would be shipped by railroad, and then you would erect it in your community. Now, I mention it because what's significant about this that we don't usually think about is there's a democratization of commemoration involved in these monuments. These monuments are to a nameless soldier, Union and Confederate. And that's important because once Americans settled on that convention, then, as I said, they went about it tirelessly, and they erected thousands of these across the North and the South. And so we end up with that monument frenzy in the period from 1890 to 1930 that filled up a lot of the commemorative landscape in both the North and the South. Now, it's hardly surprising that the monument builders used statuary to honor themselves and their heroes. Nor is there anything surprising in their insistence that their commemorative efforts were an expression of community will, when in fact the community they represented was extremely narrow. The commemorative landscape that was created in North Carolina between 1890 and 1940 reflected the hierarchical nature of North Carolina and American society. The monuments were funded by private donations from the pockets of the influential and well-heeled. It's worth keeping in mind almost all of the Confederate and Union monuments, just to use them as examples that you see that dot the American landscape, were put up through private money. These are not state-funded monuments usually. There may be a state contribution sometimes, but usually it's the smallest portion. The monuments erected exclusively honored whites, and white men at that. Now, there are a few exceptions. Next slide, please. And this is truly an extraordinary exception. This is a monument that African-American women in Hertford, North Carolina, erected to black men of the community who served in the Union Army during the Civil War. It's truly an extraordinary monument. It's the oldest monument erected in a former Confederate state, by African Americans honoring blacks who fought in the Union Army. There would be a few others that went up in Norfolk. But essentially from roughly 1910, 1912, when this was erected, until the 1990s, there were no monuments, other than this one and a couple in Norfolk, to black men who served in the Union Army in the Civil War in the Confederate States. But this, my simple point is, this is an extraordinary, exceptional monument. When women were honored, it was in their role as mothers or wives. Go to the state capitol grounds and you can see a monument to the women of the Confederacy. She's depicted, of course, in a role as a mother. Even these monuments were the exceptions that proved the rule. The commemorative landscape was dense with monuments to white men, especially white Confederates and politicians. I'm not suggesting there's anything sinister about that. It's entirely predictable. But now let's move to the next, or move through time towards the next commemorative boom that we're currently living in. Interestingly, during the tumultuous decades from the 1940s to the 1970s, the commemorative impulse in the United States waned. It's striking how modest is the commemoration of World War II and the Korean War. The monuments to World War II in this state are almost all tablets or rocks with names on them. There are very few large sculptural, representational monuments to World War II, for example, in this state. And Korean War monuments in this state typically only started to be built after Vietnam War monuments started going up. Arguably, the catalyst for late 19th century commemoration was the Vietnam War. Contrary to myth, the Vietnam War was more quickly commemorated than any previous war in this state's history. As early as 1976, monuments started going up to the Korean War in this state. And the reason why I think that's important is because the commemoration of Vietnam contributed to the further democratization of historical commemoration. So I've already suggested the Confederate memorials, the Union memorials started to depict the common soldier. Well, once people started trying to figure out how to depict Vietnam, they had to figure out how to depict a desegregated army, first desegregated war, or I should say first time a desegregated American army fought in a war. You could say yes in Korea, but that happened late in the conflict there. Also, the Vietnam War involved women. And then, of course, at the same time that the commemoration of Vietnam was picking up speed, there were the accomplishments of the civil rights movement, struggles of women for equality during the 1960s and 1970s, and the struggles by other activists to promote a more inclusive society. And so our expectations of the landscape, the commemorative landscape, have changed yet again. So the absence of women, African Americans, and Indians, just to take 3 examples in this state, is no longer tolerated in silence. The result has not only been a proliferation of monuments, but also a substantial redefinition of who and what is commemorated. 50 years ago, for instance, it is literally inconceivable that Nina Simone would have been honored with statuary. So the last slide is the monument that's been erected to Nina Simone, the great jazz, I guess you could say soul singer, pianist. So my account arrives at the present. In our times, as often as not, we commemorate the quiet heroism of common people as we do the flamboyant actions of leaders. Think of, for example, the abstract memorial, perhaps the most influential of all modern memorials, the monument to the Vietnam War on the Washington Mall, as an example. It's a monument to the men who died there. And we are more likely to depict the trauma of the past and to acknowledge the ambiguities of the past. And here one can think of monuments that we now have to chapters in American history that would not have been commemorated previously. It's not that our monuments are less didactic than those of our predecessors, but that the lessons taught are more open-ended, and that we accept that many historical events and actors don't easily fit into categorical labels. There, of course, are some great, great heroes, But there are also some moments in time when common people do extraordinary things, and we honor the extraordinary action without somehow wanting to elevate the individual people to some sort of status as saints or heroes. So when we contemplate how to commemorate the Dix Hospital and its history, I think it's appropriate to reflect on how our ideas of commemoration have evolved over the last century and a half. And I would conclude by just observing that I think at a site like this, there are so many different elements that can be incorporated into commemoration. There's, of course, a figure like Dix herself, who's a heroic figure, an innovator, a reformer, a creative person. There, of course, are all of the staff who worked often in difficult conditions. And then there are, of course, the residents themselves. And all of these different people at different moments in time are undoubtedly fitting subjects for some sort of commemoration. So thank you very much.
Lives on the Hill is a production of UNC-TV in association with North Carolina Health News. Funding for Lives on the Hill is provided by the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV. Additional funding is provided by Dix Park Conservancy, NAMI North Carolina, the City of Raleigh, Health Decisions Resources, and by the following.